Today on CityCast Nashville, we're talking about the Duck River. It's the most biodiverse river in North America and an essential part of Middle Tennessee's ecosystem. It's also one of the most endangered rivers in the country. Tennessee Lookout reporter Cassandra Stevenson is here to explain why the duck is at risk and how local leaders are responding. It's Monday, March 17th. I'm your executive producer, Whitney Pastorek, and this is what Nashville's talking about. So the Duck River is the longest river located entirely within Tennessee. It is also the most biologically diverse river in North America. It goes, for people who don't know and haven't kayaked on it, it goes from like Bonnaroo, basically, to the Tennessee River out in the Tennessee National Wildlife Refuge. And it is the sole water source for more than 250,000 people here in Tennessee.
Yes. Yeah. That is the main water source for at least 250,000 people, if not more. I think that stat is a couple years old. And as you know, there's been a lot of growth since that time.
And that growth, in fact, has posed some of the problems we're going to talk about, because the reason we're here, Cassie, is because the duck is under threat from like a billion different angles. And you've been reporting on all of those. What made you start reporting on this to begin with?
Before I came to the Lookout, Anita Wadhwani had been doing a lot of excellent reporting on the Duck River. This has been, an ongoing saga for several years. My first visit to the Duck River was concerning the drought and the impact that was having on the river and on the mussels that live in it. There's been a lot of mussels, some of which are federally endangered species, that were found like freshly dead over the last summer when water levels got pretty low. I learned so much about mussels that day, which was really enjoyable. They're fascinating creatures. A lot of the environmental groups refer to mussels as kind of the canaries in the coal mine in terms of river health. So, the fact that there's been kind of an observed increase in freshly dead mussels is pretty concerning to environmental groups regarding the river's overall health. They're kind of the first creatures to go and the last to come back.
You've spent so much time down there in the last several months, especially. Talk a little bit about what you see as the culture around the Duck River.
Sure. Yeah, it's very clear to me that some of the people who have lived on the river, sometimes their families have been there for decades. They have a lot of respect for it and a really strong desire to preserve it. They have been very concerned, especially within the last year, about the impacts of drought and also the potential impacts of allowing some of the water utilities that are located along the river to draw more water out of the river. There's, some like rocks and things that they haven't been able to see because they were covered with water in years previous. So yeah, it's been something that's definitely on people's minds. Yeah, along the riverbanks for sure.
So let's start there. Obviously, the amount of rainfall that we're getting is not something that can be locally controlled, but the way that we manage the land around the river is something that a lot of people are concerned about. Talk a little bit about how development is impacting the river.
I mean, as more homes and businesses grow, or are developed around the river, that requires more water. So we see utility companies requesting permits for millions and millions of gallons more than they already are. And one of the main things that some of the environmental groups have pushed for is stronger protections for the river during drought. So they want to have some sort of an agreement or cap on how much can be withdrawn from the river when the water levels are already low. And that would protect things like the mussels that live in the river and clean its water.
So the utility companies, what are they drawing this water for? Just to put a number on this for people, these utilities are seeking to draw up to 73 million gallons a day. Is it to cool things? Is it literally water that flows into people's taps?
Yeah, I mean, like all of the above. We mentioned earlier that at least 250,000 people in and around the Duck River rely on it for their water.
What towns are we talking about here?
I mean, it's Middle Tennessee in general. It hasn't gotten down to some counties. Like Hickman hasn't really seen that level of growth yet. It's mostly up the river. But in talking to representatives and people that live there, it's something they're expecting to eventually come downriver.
But right now it's Dixon.
Yeah, Dixon, kind of, like far reaching suburbs of Nashville. Columbia to some extent.
And I spotted another factoid that these utility companies are not just wanting to pull 73 million gallons, again, inconceivably large amount of water, but it's possible that they're leaking up to 25% of that and that's allowed.
Yeah. And that was one of the things that environmental groups took a lot of issue with. And they did recently reach settlements in those cases that in some cases kind of limited that a little bit more. I think in some it was maybe 15% and some was 20%. But that is basically just loss due to leakage.
And that's leakage from their pipes?
Yeah, from any part of the process of withdrawing the water from the river.
It's also that these developments create runoff. We've seen this here in Nashville with all the new construction, right? You put concrete down where there used to be grass, and suddenly things are getting flooded that never have been before. And that's impacting the farmers.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty common to see flooding on farmland, especially if there aren't like preserved wetlands around the river that can help soak up those floodwaters.
How convenient that you mentioned wetlands. Another reason why the Duck River is under attack right now. What is going on in the Tennessee legislature about wetlands?
So Representative Vaughn has a bill, kind of a carryover from last session, that basically would limit state protections for wetlands to the federal level of protections for wetlands. And those have changed recently too. The U.S. Supreme Court in the Sackett decision limited the definition of waters of the United States to basically wetlands that have connections on the surface to navigable bodies of water.
What does navigable mean?
You would be able to like navigate them, like, on a kayak, for example. So it would remove some of those protections from these things called like isolated wetlands, which are wetlands that might only be present for part of the year and they might not be directly connected to like the river, say. But I mean, as we know, there's always kind of a connection with groundwater. A lot of times wetlands also act as kind of a filter of sorts.
Right. I was going to ask you why they're important.
Yeah. When it floods, water kind of soaks into these wetlands and it can help replenish groundwater and aquifers to keep, things like rivers healthy, even if it's not necessarily connected on the surface.
And so Representative Vaughn, he's a Republican out of Collierville. He has said that, like you're saying, Cassie, it would really only impact these sort of like puddles in fields where cows and tractors live. But in fact, it looks like, according to the Southern Environmental Law Center, this would strip protection from as many as 300,000 acres once you put it all together.
Yeah, that's what they've estimated. And a good portion of wetlands along the Duck River would be affected as well. I think it's about 16,000 acres. If this bill moves forward as is, it could always be amended. It doesn't look like it's been amended yet. But the Harpeth Conservancy has also estimated that about 16,000 acres of wetlands specifically along the Duck River could be impacted. And about 80% of those are less than 1 acre. So it's, smaller areas that still act as catches for rainfall. They can still host a pretty biologically diverse little ecosystem, even if they're only wet for certain times of the year.
This episode is sponsored by Babbel. Are you holding back on foreign travel plans this year because you're afraid of the language gap? I'm not, because I have Babbel. I'm David Plotz, the CEO of CityCast, and I'm learning Spanish on Babbel, getting ready for a trip to Mexico City. Babbel is the language learning app that gets you talking. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons, handcrafted by over 200 language experts, get you to begin speaking your new language in 3 weeks or at whatever pace you choose. Babbel's tips and tools are inspired by the real-life stuff you actually need when communicating. With a focus on conversation, you'll be ready to talk wherever you go. Babbel has given me great lessons on getting directions, ordering in a restaurant, and making plans. And of all the things I'm doing in Mexico City, I'm probably most excited about the soccer game we're going to. So I was excited to learn how to cheer from Babbel. That'll be me you'll hear yelling, "Fuerza Tigres! Fuerza Tigres!" With over 16 million subscriptions sold, Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by a 20-day money-back guarantee. Let's get more of you talking in a new language. Babbel is gifting our listeners 60% off subscriptions at babbel.com/citycast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/citycast. Spelled BABBEL.com/citycast. Babbel.com/citycast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
My favorite place in Nashville to take friends from out of town is the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum. It makes me feel so proud to be able to show off our city's country music roots. But y'all, it's not just a tourist attraction. Did you know that local kids always visit free at the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum? Kids age 18 and under who are residents of Davidson and bordering counties, including Cheatham, Robertson, Rutherford, Sumner, Williamson, and Wilson, can take advantage of all the engaging and educational activities the museum has to offer this spring at no cost. Plus, they can bring 2 accompanying adults who get 25% off admission. I love the museum's Taylor Swift Education Center. They've got music, dance, art programs, and on Fridays this month, you can check out Irish step dancing, a musical instrument petting zoo, and plenty of other fun activities. Learn more and plan your visit at countrymusichofoffame.org/local-kids.
Another bill that's up at the legislature right now involves landfills. Representative Chris Todd, another Republican, is looking to eliminate. Currently, right now, there's a 2-mile buffer between a landfill and what's called a Class 2 scenic river. And this seems to be mostly so that somebody can build a big old landfill in Murray County. Now, I know we're running out of places to put our trash, but it does feel like having a landfill right next to a river is a bad idea. Can you talk about that?
Representative Todd says that this bill is not directly related to the Duck River, but we've kind of seen the Duck River and landfills come up pretty recently in the legislature. A couple years ago, Trinity Business Group wanted to put 2 landfills on a site that does fall within 2 miles of the river. And at that point in time, the Duck wasn't, or those portions of the Duck were not classified as Class 2 scenic rivers.
What is a Class 2 scenic river?
So a Class 2 scenic river is a river or a section of a river that's basically free-flowing with some pastoral lands surrounding it. It's generally not polluted. There are scenic vistas. A lot of the land surrounding it is usually used for agriculture, recreational activities, and it's generally accessible for public use.
Okay. So a nice river that we haven't totally trashed yet.
True. Yes.
Which currently describes a lot of the Duck, you kayak and there's cows. That all makes sense.
Yeah.
You're also currently reporting on some legislation designed to potentially roll back protections against forever chemicals. Draw that connection for those who can't get it on their own between landfills, forever chemicals, and rivers.
I mean, there's always concern about things like runoff there. And of course, like the state has certain regulations and things in place to limit that from landfills. But as a lot of environmental groups have contended, that risk is kind of always there. Forever chemicals are man-made chemicals used in things like firefighting foam or used to make things water repellent that basically are persistent, so they last, and they're probably in everyone's blood at this point.
Right. It's like we have a spoon's worth of plastic in our brains now.
Yeah. Terrifying thought, but yes. So there aren't regulations in place right now to limit the amount of forever chemicals allowed to be like essentially found in bodies of water or drinking water.
The Chamber of Commerce is behind this. That means that this really all boils down to it being pro-business, and pro-business usually does translate to anti-regulation. We see that a ton here in Tennessee. But something I find interesting about this is that we've got another state Republican, Jody Barrett, who represents Hickman County, who is actually pushing back against a lot of this stuff. Can you talk a little bit about some of his pushback and where it's coming from?
Sure. I mean, the residents of Hickman County are really passionate about the Duck River specifically. So, you know, they've really pushed for that protection. Hickman County lies downstream of a lot of the significant development that's happening in the upper portion of Middle Tennessee, more toward Nashville. So any decisions or regulations or lack thereof that happen upstream will have an impact on the residents of Hickman County.
Literally flows downstream.
It literally does. Yes. Yeah. I mean, Representative Barrett has been pretty outspoken about wanting to make sure that, you know, whatever happens upstream, they're considering those impacts.
And clearly the outcry from people like Representative Barrett, but also like the farmers, the multi-generation farmers that you were talking about earlier in this conversation, that has reached the governor's office. Governor Lee made the Duck River a sort of a centerpiece of this year's State of the State, pledging $100 million for conservation, launched this Duck River planning partnership, talking about potentially rerouting river from the Tennessee River to help meet those water needs. How do you envision all of this working?
I mean, it's still kind of in, I guess, preliminary stages. The idea of creating some sort of pipeline from the Tennessee River to provide water to this portion of Middle Tennessee isn't a new one. Basically, the Tennessee River is just a much, bigger river and not necessarily as biologically diverse and fragile as the Duck River. So the idea is that pulling water in from that resource might have potentially less of a detrimental impact on the nature that exists along the Duck River in Middle Tennessee. That would be very expensive and would require a lot more cooperation, legal processes, all of that. So I think it's going to be a while before we see something happen in that realm. What the governor did do, as you said, was set up kind of like an advisory committee that includes representatives from the water utilities, from environmental groups, local government representatives, to come together and create some recommendations for what to do when there's drought, how to adjust what the utilities are doing so that they can protect the river from lasting harm. So that is kind of, I think, what we're going to see the most movement on in the meantime.
I sometimes feel like Tennessee is a very confusing state to live in environmentally speaking, Because you end up with these situations where it's easy to make assumptions that all Republicans are pro-growth and anti-regulation and don't care about the tree hugging. But at the same time, especially surrounding this issue, seems like everyone's really able to see both sides and recognize that they're vitally important.
It's interesting because in some respects, the environment is a really bipartisan issue because we all live in it. And yeah, like I said, some people have lived along these rivers or in really pastoral lands for multiple generations. So what happens to it really matters to them. And I think that, no one necessarily wants to see like a very naturally beautiful place that they've grown up maybe swimming in or kayaking on or what have you, like ruined, for lack of a better term. It doesn't necessarily break down on party lines.
I think a lot of people here in Nashville really do just view the Duck as a wonderful place for recreation, for fishing, to take your kids on the weekend, to float down with a beer in your hand. But it is really a centerpiece of our entire Middle Tennessee ecosystem, is what I've gleaned from your reporting. So how can folks up here get involved? How should folks talk about this and make sure that people are aware of what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, reading your local news is always a good idea. Little shameless plug there. I mean, also, talking to representatives, if you have an opinion on this. And that's what a lot of these environmental groups are doing. The Duck River Conservancy has also sprung up over the last year or so. So there are a lot of grassroots groups that people could look into if they feel so inclined.
What's maybe been your favorite moment of just enjoying the river while you've been out there, not thinking about the troubles, but just appreciating what it is?
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't love to walk on the banks of a scenic river? A
Class 2 scenic river.
Class 2, well, parts of it, yes, parts of it. I would say that it has to do with, again, like the mussels, like being pulled out of the water. One of the people working with the Southern Environmental Law Center was there to kind of, show us healthy mussels versus like, this is a freshly dead mussel. And he pulled out this massive, I think it was called a washboard mussel. And he said, holding it up, like, this mussel filters like 50 gallons of water a day. And wow. And that was crazy. I mean, it's just a very interesting visual to see, like, wow, this, this being is doing all of that work to clean the water. And then seeing, all of the mussel shells that are still looking pretty like clean on the inside, meaning they're like freshly dead a couple feet away. That visual definitely sticks with me.
Well, thank you so much for your reporting. We'll keep tracking this story and hopefully we'll have that watershed to serve us and our neighboring communities for generations to come.
Yeah, there's never any shortage of news on the Duck River, is what I found over the last few months.
Thank you, Cassie, for everything you're doing to make us aware of this important story. That's all for today here on CityCast Nashville. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell your friends? Rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our wonderful Hey Nashville newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Y'all take care of each other.